Hey first graders, so I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about poetry. Now this might be something that you've already talked about with your teacher. It might be something brand new. Maybe you haven't talked about it with your teacher, and that's okay. We're going to talk a little bit about what poetry is and what it looks like. So poetry is really just another way to write. So just like when you go to write, you can write stories, you can write personal narratives, you can write informational writing. Poetry is just another way for you to write. And a lot of times when you write poetry, you'll create feelings or emotions when you write. And then sometimes you just write to be silly and have fun. So let's take a look at what a lot of poems have. Not all of them have it, but let's take a look at what some poems can have, some different elements of poetry. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the elements of poetry that you might see in a poem. Now, elements is just a big word that means like the things that you'll see in a poem. Now, you may not see all of these in a poem, but you might see some of them in each poem that you read. So one of the things that you might see are rhyming words, which is probably what a lot of the poems that you all have read have in them. So the poems that you all have read probably have a lot of rhyming words in them, or words that sound the same and have the same ending sound. Something else you might see are sensory details. So words or phrases that, and phrases is just a big word that means like a group of words, but words or phrases that have to do with your five senses. Something else you might hear is or see is a rhythm or like a beat to your poem. So that just means like when you listen to a song or even like a rap, it'll have a beat to it or a rhythm to it. And then another thing you might see is an onomatopoeia, which we know is just that's a really silly word, or it sounds silly, but we know it's just a big word that means a word that sounds like what you're saying, a sound word. And then you might see repetition. So you might see words that repeat over and over again. Now, again, you may not see all of these in every poem, but you'll probably see at least one of these things in each poem that you read or that you write. So let's take a look at some examples of some different poems that you're going to get a chance to read and kind of look at and tell me the different elements that you see in those poems. Okay, so the first type of poem that I'm going to show you guys really quickly is called a limerick poem. And a limerick poem is where you hear a lot of those rhyming words. So a limerick poem is going to have 5 lines in it. That means like here's one line and then you go down to the next line. So there's 5 lines. The first, the second, and the 5th line are all going to rhyme. But then those 2 other lines, the 3rd and the 4th, those 2 middle lines, those will rhyme, but not all of those lines are going to rhyme. So some of them will and some of them won't. And a limerick poem can be serious or it can be silly. So let's take a look at an example of a limerick poem. Okay, so for our limerick poem, it's called Belly Ache. And you can see that there are 5 lines, but let's read it and see which lines rhyme and which ones don't. So let's take a look. It says, once there was a bug who really liked to hug. Those 2 rhyme. He ate a big lunch. He had too much. So those 2 lines rhyme. Let's look at the last one. He fell asleep in a mug. So mug rhymes with the first 2 lines with bug and hug. And then the 3rd and 4th line both rhyme with lunch and much. So I don't know about you, but I think the limerick poems are really fun to read because they have those rhyming words. But now let's take a look at a different type of poem. All right, so this poem is called an acrostic poem. And between you and me, it's my favorite one because I love how what you do is you take a word and you write it going down. You go vertical instead of going across like you normally would write it. So you write that one word going down your page, and then what you do is you choose a topic and you choose a word or even a sentence that you're going to write with each word. But the trick is that each word has to start with whatever that letter is that you've written down the side of your paper. So I know that sounds kind of confusing, so let's take a look at what that actually looks like. Okay, so now you can actually see what an acrostic poem actually looks like. It's easier to see it than to just kind of explain it. So you can see that we took the word teacher and we wrote it going down the side of the page. Then what we did is we came up with a word that had to do with the topic. So we came up with words that had to do with being a teacher. And we made sure that each word that we put next to that letter started with that letter. So if you look at the letter T, that's the first letter in teacher, we came up with the word thoughtful because thoughtful starts with the T. Then as you go down the page, you can see that each word starts with that letter in the word teacher. And you can do it with any topic or any word, which is really cool. So let's take a look at one more type of poem. Okay, our last poem that we're going to talk about is called a haiku poem. And a haiku is only going to have 3 lines. So just like our limerick poem that we learned about first has 5 lines, this one actually only has 3 lines. And you really have to know syllables for a haiku because each line can only have a certain number of syllables, which is really interesting. So the first line can have 5 syllables. The second line is going to have 7 syllables, and then the third line is going to go back to having 5 syllables. So remember, syllables are like the parts of your word, and a lot of times if you put your hand underneath your chin, it helps you, like every time your chin hits your hand, then it kind of helps you figure out how many syllables are in that word or in that sentence. So let's take a look at an example of a haiku. Okay, so let's take a look at this example of a haiku poem. So you can see it has 3 lines, but let's take a look at that first line and let's see if it has 5 syllables like we talked about. So let's try it. I teach little kids. That's 5. I teach little kids. So it has 5 syllables in it. And then the second line has 7 syllables in it. To read, write, and be kind friends. That has 7 syllables. And then the last line has 5 syllables in it. While having fun too. So pretty cool how that works. It's a little challenging, but it is a really cool poem to be able to read and to write. So I hope this helped you have a really good idea of different types of poems, because what you're going to do is you're going to go back to Seesaw and you're going to read a poem for me, and then you're going to tell me what elements you see, elements of poetry that you see in each of the poems, and then you're going to tell me what type of poem it is. So is it a limerick poem? Is it an acrostic poem, or is it a haiku poem? And if you need to, you can always come back to this video to remind yourself what each of our poems are like, okay?